This is Terms of Reference podcast number 144.
We've arrived at a time when people are realizing that the bureaucratic systems around supply chains are very heavy, that it's an area that is ripe for disruption, and humanitarian innovation systems are now emerging to support that kind of disruption.
This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. While we live in a world of unprecedented prosperity for many, we also live in a world that is experiencing unprecedented levels of humanitarian crisis. You know the examples: protracted violent conflicts, devastation caused by earthquakes or hurricanes or other natural disasters, the specters of famine or disease outbreaks. The list goes on, unfortunately. The good news is that we have a humanitarian community that does a fantastic job of responding to these crises with the resources available to them. In large part, supplies arrive, shelter is provided, and people receive care until a time in which they can begin the transition back to normalcy. Unfortunately, as with the creation of any system, developing the capacity to address these large-scale crises has produced unintended consequences and externalities. One of these externalities is a logistics and supply chain ecosystem that is bureaucratic, expensive, and rigid. On this, the 144th episode of the Terms of Reference podcast, I talk with Andrew Lamb of Field Ready about how their organization is disrupting logistics and supply chains currently associated with humanitarian aid by helping to solve problems at the source in the communities affected by crisis. Andrew is the innovation advisor for Field Ready. He's the former CEO of Engineers Without Borders in the UK. He co-founded and serves as a trustee of the Humanitarian Centre in Cambridge, and he's a trustee of Red R UK. You're going to love this episode because it's packed with specific examples about how Field Ready is disrupting the delivery of humanitarian aid through design, process reengineering, 3D printing, and a ton more. I spoke with Andrew in Nairobi. But quickly, before we start the show, a shout out from our sponsor.
The Terms of Reference podcast is sponsored by International Solutions Group, helping to improve the social impact of governments, UN agencies, NGOs, and companies for more than 10 years. Visit ISG online at www.theisg.com.
Hello, Andrew. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm delighted to be part of it.
Andrew, you are with an organization called Field Ready. You're an innovation advisor.
Yeah.
But you are also a humanitarian and development man of mystery like everyone on this show. Where do we find you sitting today?
I've just arrived in Nairobi. I'm here to wrap up a project that we've been working on in the last few months, researching some new opportunities around distributed manufacturing. Beautiful morning, blue skies, watching the kids go to school from the apartment we've rented for the week, and you might be able to hear some chickens in the background. I'm sorry for that.
Sounds beautiful. Sounds beautiful. Yep. So you are with an organization, as I said, Field Ready. Why don't we start off with you giving us what's Field Ready all about? What's the proposition? What do you do differently?
Sort of driving idea behind Field Ready comes from the sort of everyday experiences of humanitarian relief workers, where they want to be able to do the best they can do to help people who've been affected by disaster, to relieve suffering and reduce the number of fatalities that are caused by disasters. But they find themselves at the mercy of, for want of a better phrase, at the mercy of supply chains, that they often can't get the things that they need to do their jobs properly when and where they need them. So our founders are humanitarian relief workers who was very strongly motivated by the problem of having, say, a whole number of Toyota Land Cruisers available for them to use in South Sudan, but actually in practice, maybe only 3 of them, 3 of the 10 of them are actually able to work because the other 7 are being cannibalized for spare parts. Because you just can't get spare parts there, or that medical clinics can't do particular diagnoses or even small medical procedures because they don't have the right equipment. So, people suffer and can even die as a result of for the want of a thing, for the want of a particular item. And there's an awful lot of improvisation and making do, as well as doing without, in the humanitarian sector, because the supply chains can be so difficult. So Field Ready's idea is, why don't we make humanitarian supplies to make what's needed, where it's needed, when it's needed? And that's taken us down humanitarian innovation path, which is quite novel, which is quite new, and it's applying distributed manufacturing, local production, digital manufacturing technologies such as devices like laser cutting or 3D printing, or even just developing designs for local welders to use to be able to make things when and where they're needed. To fill the gaps in supply chains.
Just with that description, I mean, laser cutters, 3D printers, these types of things. You guys must be the sexiest group that shows up in a disaster or in a place that needs help. I mean, do you have that air about you? Obviously it's not intentional, but there's some really cool equipment that you're bringing into these places. Do you feel like that attracts a lot of attention, or is that it's not a thing?
I think we've got some pretty sexy stories to tell and some pretty great photos. I think the reality is that particularly the likes of 3D printing, or use of 3D printing technology, as with a lot of innovations, it can be a blessing and a curse. And the sexiness betrays the sheer hard work and level of expertise and talent that is required to try and make sure that the humanitarian innovations, this sort of humanitarian innovation, is being applied properly. To unpack that a little bit, one of the things that really attracted me personally to Field Ready is the fact that this organization is one that is problem-driven rather than solution-driven. So we were set up, as I said, by relief workers who were fed up of not having the things that they needed to do relief work, and not from a place of, oh, look, here's a 3D printer. I wonder how that could be used. So it was problem pull rather than solution push. The other thing that attracted me to it is the caliber of the people involved. I mean, I've got colleagues who have, worked on 3D printers for NASA on the International Space Station, who have invented parts for the Boeing 787 Dreamliner because Boeing couldn't figure out how to get it to work, who have led humanitarian relief agencies in Afghanistan and South Sudan, and who've led the global open data movement. So that some really incredible people at Field Ready, and that was part of the attraction to it. So and then the idea of it being a blessing and a curse, particularly with 3D printing, is that the response that we get locally from some of the, say, district water engineers that we might be working with in the earthquake-affected districts of Nepal, they love it. They can really see its usefulness. The media loves it. The headline for our work when the media writes about us is often the 3D printing and disaster relief sort of thing. So that's great. The reason it's a bit of a curse is that Field Ready is known as almost as the 3D printing people within the humanitarian sector. And actually 3D printing is fairly limited.
You've suddenly been given a hammer, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's just one of a whole range of manufacturing processes that we use. And actually it's quite a limited technology. And there are people within the humanitarian sector who've been looking into 3D printing themselves and basically realized its limitations. So we're coming up against existing preconceptions in the sector that 3D printing does have its limits and therefore isn't necessarily useful. So whereas our approach is to basically use it where it's appropriate and to use other processes when it's not appropriate.
Yeah, one of the questions I had written down was, you've essentially answered this right now, but I'd still want to ask it to get your opinion. Would Field Ready have been possible 10 years ago or 15 years ago? So what I'm hearing you say is it's not that there has been this confluence of new technology, new access to, like, for instance, 3D printing or mobile technology, this or that. It's really grounded in the approach of the founders and the approach of saying being problem-driven rather than solution-driven. What do you think about that?
It would have been possible 10 years ago, yes. The difference is essentially one that the humanitarian innovation ecosystem, if we can call it that, was quite immature then. And it's taken a whole series of interventions by donors and others to create a system that supports humanitarian innovation, which basically means that we can afford to take some of the risks that aid agencies found difficult otherwise. Local production, making things locally, is usually the first preference of humanitarian relief agencies. But the bureaucratic procedures which have been built to sort of safeguard against corruption or against poor quality, against, any to try and improve accountability, that those sorts of procedures in supply chains have really made it very difficult to be able to procure humanitarian supplies locally for some types of humanitarian supplies. Shelter, for example, shelter supplies are normally procured locally, but the likes of medical supplies might not be.
I was going to say, when I'm thinking, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm thinking of UNICEF responding to a disaster or an outbreak of malaria or something like that.
Yep.
Those medications those come straight from Copenhagen, don't they?
Yeah, and it depends on the item, but yes, generally there's...
I'm generalizing, but what I'm saying is that many times these supplies come in and they may even be politically driven in that, the Buy America Act, right, or whatever from USAID. There's a lot of U.S. products that come specifically for U.S. products to support U.S. products, right?
There is. There's all sorts of different pressures on procurement systems for good and bad, but I think we have emerged as an organization at a time when people are realizing that the systems that have been set up in good faith around logistics, about trying to make sure that you can get the things that you need when and where you need it, are now so heavy and so bureaucratic that actually people are looking for innovation, but they're still not quite willing to take the risks of poor quality. If they get a medical item that just quite frankly doesn't work, then the whole object of being able to make something procure locally kind of falls apart. So you have to start procuring internationally, where you have standards and quality assurance systems and things like that. We've arrived at a time when people are realizing that the bureaucratic systems around supply chains are very heavy, that it's an area that is ripe for disruption, and humanitarian innovation systems are now emerging to support that kind of disruption. So I think, but from a technology point of view and from a need point of view, this could have been done 10 years ago. I think it's actually something more within the humanitarian system itself that has led to the rise of our kind of innovation.
So take us there. Give us one or two stories about some specific either devices or solutions to the problems that you've identified where procuring or creating locally have made a difference.
Sure. I'm going to start out with one that I know best because I've been based in Nepal I've been working there for the last sort of 18 months, but based in Nepal for the last sort of 7-8 months. The Nuwakot District Hospital, which has been supported by World Vision, is essentially a clinic based in some temporary shelters, in some tents. And a lot of the equipment there has been brought in or has been augmented by the response to the earthquakes in 2015. In this particular clinic, there was a shelter, a ward, I suppose, that had 6 beds. And each of the beds had sort of electrical equipment, electronic equipment beside them to help monitor the patients. So that's all well and good. The issue that they were having, and one that we couldn't anticipate when we decided to go and visit this health post, was that actually the power supply to this particular ward, with these 6 beds, was intermittent. And the reason the power supply was intermittent is because a tiny little plastic clip on the top of the power distribution board had snapped. So the plug didn't clip into the socket properly, and it was quite a big power supply, so it was actually quite hard to tape into place and to get it to stay there. So my colleagues Abby Bush and Ramchandra Thapa visited Newark District Hospital expecting to sort of do some 3D printing of umbilical cord clamps or forceps or tweezers, sort of some of the standard medical supplies that we've been working on. But in addition to that, they identified this problem with the nurses that actually they didn't have a stable power supply to the clinic. What they did was they looked at the power distribution board and they took the electrical connector off the top, they measured it up. We're using rulers and calipers, made a 3D model of it, printed out that 3D model, tested it, made some changes, printed out, updated the design, did a new design, printed out a final version, and replaced the electrical connector on the power distribution board so that it was fixed again and they had a stable power supply to the clinic. Now you're talking about a little clip that broke, a few millimeters worth of plastic that just happens to have snapped, and we were able to print a copy. In about that process of identification of design, prototype, and final version being attached took 7.5 hours and cost us about $1 worth of plastic. We asked World Vision, who was supporting the clinic, how much it would have cost to replace it through the normal channels, and they said they'd been trying. They found that the manufacturer didn't sell that particular replacement part, so they would have had to have bought an entire new power distribution board. That would be about $1,500 off the shelf from a manufacturer in Milan, in Italy. So it would have taken about 6 weeks to ship to Kathmandu, and then it would have taken a few weeks to get it up into Newark District and actually install it. The total estimate is, if they'd used the traditional route, it would have cost about $3,000 or more and taken about 2 months. We were able to make our replacement part in 7.5 hours, costing probably a total of about $75 to $100 with labor costs included.
Wow.
So
that's profound.
It just shows that actually the cost, whilst this was an expensive item, the actual plastic connector is very cheap. You can't get that spare part, so you have to replace the whole thing. So you begin to realize that through that example, the cost of the item that you need is actually largely embedded in whether it's available and in the supply chain. So if you can get rid of those as factors, and you can make something locally to a very high standard using some of these new disruptive technologies, you can really make incredible efficiency savings and add significant value.
So before I dive deeper with Andrew and ask him about the day-to-day operations of how Field Ready works, I wanted to take a moment to talk to you. You've been listening to this podcast for the last 20 minutes, and if you're finding value in stories like these, with real examples about, how disrupting the social sector and helping people in need better, I'd like to take a moment to just ask you for your support, because it actually does matter. So could you take a moment to either leave me a review in iTunes or simply share this episode with your community, like through Facebook or through Twitter or Snapchat or whatever it is that you decide to use? And I especially love it when people, ask a question on the blog or come to our website and ask a question, because we get them all and I answer every single one of them. It only takes a couple of clicks and it really does help. And if you're truly interested in making the social sector better, sign up for my newsletter or subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode or update. Take me there. So this is fantastic. You had a team already in Nepal. They were able to travel there. They identified the problem. It sounded like they were already traveling there anyway to provide some other services. So this was an add-on, right? It was a nice externality to the. How does Field Ready work in that way? Because do you just have teams sort of sitting around saying, hey, we're kind of like, geeks on call, where people can say, hey, we got a problem, and, you're rocked up and ready to go? Like, take me through the process of how does Field Ready organize itself? How are you funded? Like, those kinds of, because it sounds very different than, as you say, a World Vision or another organization like that.
Well, yes. I mean, I suppose it can sound different, but we're organized essentially as a humanitarian aid agency. We see ourselves as a humanitarian aid agency that is about trying to get supplies to the places where they're needed, when they're needed. So, I'll talk you through the process of how we set up in Nepal. We did an assessment trip, first of all, and quite soon after the earthquake, we did an assessment visit there. Our director, Eric, went out and made some contacts, did some opportunities, and basically identified that we'd need to give it a couple of months after the immediate relief effort before we could start doing something more substantial there, because of the scale of the crisis. Almost it's a rapid onset, major disaster, and we weren't at that time a particularly large organization. We basically, a few months later, following the plan, we did a full-on 2-week assessment trip where we went out with some of our equipment. Myself and my colleague Mark Mellers met with a whole load of aid agencies and visited a number of different IDP camps, spoke with local manufacturers, started doing some training courses and recruited local makers, with an eye to recruiting local makers. And by the end of that 2 weeks, we had an idea of basically what was needed. But moreover, we had a real opportunity with World Vision, who were setting up something called the Nepal Innovation Lab. They were really interested in using the response to the earthquake, an opportunity to advance some of their priorities around humanitarian innovation to try and really improve the way that they do humanitarian relief, something that they jointly wanted to do with other aid agencies responding to the earthquakes. So we decided to help the Nepal Innovation Lab to get started. They provided us with space, and we were part funded by World Vision and by a private donor in the United States who really liked what we were doing. And we recruited Abby Bush and Ramchandra Thapa, who I mentioned in that story, around a few different priorities. But basically, they had a year there to look at the use of 3D printing, of the use of the local plastics industry, training up local entrepreneurs and working with World Vision to try and incorporate some of the local production processes we were talking about into their normal supply chains. A shorter version of that answer I've just given you is an assessment trip followed by a program, a mixture of international and local manufacturing expertise, and working in partnership. On this occasion, we had an arrangement where it was part funded by the aid agency that wanted our services and part funded by a private donor.
Does it have a set time frame, or you've set up your operation for, let's just say 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, and then you'll pull out, or is it sort of, again, problem solution driven, where you're like, hey, you know what, we think that we've offered all we can offer here, it's time for us to pack up, or is it indefinite?
It's not indefinite. We're a humanitarian aid agency, so we focus on the humanitarian crises. The first year of the earthquake response, the first 18 months of the earthquake response, is really when we see ourselves as being most active. And I think after that, there is essentially that we need to transition with the humanitarian aid agency into other phases of a response. So
I was just going to say, like, do you have a handoff, sort of period where you can say, hey, look, we think the emergency, we're calling it a close, and then here's our handover procedure to whomever, or?
Yeah, I mean, and we're kind of running through that now in Nepal. What we're doing in Nepal now is we're following the humanitarian sector as they move from the relief through to the reconstruction and recovery, the reconstruction phases. So what we're doing now in Nepal with the support of the DFID Frontier Technologies live streaming program is basically doing capacity building for a 3D printing industry within Nepal, so that basically Field Ready can leaving behind trained people and established organizations that can be contracted by World Vision, Save the Children, UNICEF and others to make things for them. So basically leaving behind the capacity to do local production when Field Ready leaves Nepal, so that someone else can carry on that kind of supply to the relief agencies that are working there.
What's been the reaction of other, let's just say larger, more established aid agencies, as you said, Save the Children, World Vision, UNICEF, MSF? They, when you guys started to show up, were they like, wow, this is something we've needed forever, this is great? Or was it, hey, you're cutting in on our turf? Or is it symbiotic? Or what's been the general, has it been difficult to get a toehold, I guess is what I'm saying?
It hasn't, no. The response has been overwhelmingly positive, and difficulty we have, it's a really nice problem to have, is that we actually can't keep up with the demand for our work.
That's what everybody wants, fantastic.
We've recently been supported by the Humanitarian Innovation Fund, a new program that they have called Accelerating the Journey to Scale. And the objective there is to set up in 10 new countries or deployments, new programs in the next 2 years. And at the same time, to invest in capturing and distilling some of the knowledge that we have developed through these field deployments that we've done already in Nepal, in Syria, in Turkey, in Haiti, and in Kenya, deployments we've got coming up in South Sudan and in Myanmar, to try and distill some of the learning into technologies that aid agencies can buy themselves, and basically some kits. So I guess the big challenge for us is responding to the positive interest and to see whether these sorts of aid agencies are interested in buying kits to help them and help their local partners, ministries of health, etc., to become producers themselves. I think the basic idea behind the kit is that in the same way that you might have a photocopier, which is essentially a small printing press, or a coffee machine, which is a small cafe, and you're used to having these sorts of machines in your office, the idea would be to have a little field-ready kit which would make medical devices for you. So you could go to it and press a button, crank a handle, and out pops your pair of tweezers, or out pops your forceps, out pops your water fitting. So a real test for us is whether that over the next couple of years is to explore whether aid agencies would be interested in that approach of buying a kit. If I can briefly say, the one area where we have had quite significant challenge to our approach is in some of the decision-making requirements. Unless there is a space for humanitarian innovation, it can become quite difficult. Although we do sort of contract work for sort of procurement departments of aid agencies already, one of the things that we come up against is that some of the items we'd like to make are already part of sort of 5-year framework supplier agreements.
You've run up against the IDIQ or those kinds of things.
Yeah. And some of these have no compete clauses. So the idea of being able to make a UNICEF height measuring board in Kathmandu and essentially to be funded to do that, it's a fairly standard nutrition program item to measure the height of children to assess stunting. To be able to make that in Nepal would conflict with UNICEF Copenhagen's existing supplier arrangements. And no matter how much the people in the field want and need these things, and no matter how much they struggle to actually get these height measuring boards through Copenhagen quickly and cheaply, it's just not something that UNICEF can do because they're tied into these framework contracts with existing suppliers. So,
have you had any break in that logjam at all? I mean, it sounds like you're putting something on the table that is potentially better, not only better, but faster and cheaper for everyone. Now, of course, there's some pretty heavy economic interest involved here. But, I mean, ultimately that's what the humanitarian aid agency is supposed to do, right?
It is, and the fact that local production, we are now able to produce things that are cheaper, better, and faster than through traditional supply chains and that we're developing an evidence base for that is really important. So part of it is actually getting the timing right so that when these framework contracts do come up for renewal, that we're able to say, have you considered rather than going to a single supplier for the globe, single global supplier, have you considered going to lots of small local suppliers? And by the way, here's a system that we think will help you.
I was just going to say, you just have to put on the table that you're able to. The whole point of a single source is so that the procurement officer in Copenhagen can manage that relationship, right? Whereas if you said, okay, here's the 2,000 small, local organizations you now have to manage, you've kind of turned it on its head. I'm wondering, but though, is there the potential for what I would call a yes and clause in these global agreements, where it's like, yes, okay, for the 99% of the procurement, you can either sole source or have, a finite number of sources for it. But the yes and would be in cases where you can fix this board in Nepal for $7 and do it in a week, whereas it'll take $3,000. Would there be a yes and clause, that kind of thing? I don't even know if that's possible. I'm making it up on the spot.
I certainly hope so, Stephen. I guess what we're trying to find that out now. At this point, it becomes really important to us to be able to latch into the humanitarian innovation ecosystems, to have really, really good, strong partnerships with aid agencies at the head office and in the field, as well as at the local delivery levels. And we're also, just making sure that we have a team that, quite frankly, has the right attitude, that has the willingness to work in partnerships, even if that might mean that you can't go quite as fast as you might like. It means you can go on the journey together, to use that cliche.
Sure.
But basically, it becomes really important that we have the attitude of a humanitarian aid agency that is looking towards the long-term objective of improving humanitarian relief work, rather than, say, of a manufacturer or a design agency that is desperately trying to win contracts, or of technology startups that are busy trying to disrupt an existing business. I'm pretty sure that we have the attitude of a humanitarian aid agency. And that's something that other aid agencies respect, and that leads to these very good, strong networks and good relationships within the ecosystem.
I love that you made that distinction, because everything you've described is an innovation and a disruptor, right? I mean, you're by no means thumbing your nose at the systems that are in place today, but you're saying, look, here's an alternative. Let's think about it a different way, and we want to talk to you as a peer, not as an upstart, right? And if let's take an analogy where Uber could have said, "Hey, taxi systems around the world," and said, "Hey, let's work together to solve this problem better." They have nope, we're going to just blow you up and we're going to take over. There's a very different approach there.
Exactly, and not as someone who's trying to sell a product. We're an organization, a humanitarian organization that has capabilities, and we're looking for the opportunities to apply those capabilities in partnership with other aid agencies. We're not trying to sell a product, and our revenues, our ability to sustain our organization financially are not dependent on that. We're always interested in exploring different types of business models for different types of things that we make. But ultimately, we're a humanitarian aid agency, and that's the way we're going to be operating. I think the other part of it is that goes back to why humanitarian innovation and the humanitarian innovation movement within the disaster relief sector is actually really important for being able to make this happen. Yes, the cost of 3D printers or laser cutters is coming down, which means you can reproducibly deliver the quality that you might expect from mass production processes locally. But There have been welders and car repair workshops and all of these other sorts of local producers available
very long
for
time.
Years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
sure. You talked earlier about the kit that you were creating as a way to sort of one way of standardization. Do you see? I'm lucky enough to just peripherally know about this this Humanitarian Innovation Fund award that you got. Congratulations on that, by the way.
Thank you.
And I know that, as you said, one of those ways is looking to how do we codify what we do? How do we standardize it? Are there other specific ways that you're looking at of saying, look, of standardizing processes or standardizing methodology or even just, specific fixes so that you're coming up with manuals or ways that other people can take these and run with them?
Yes. So let me give you an example. Let me give you two examples, one from Syria and one from Kenya, if I may. The first in Syria, we've been operating out of Istanbul doing R&D and out of Idlib, just near Aleppo, in Syria, to work on making search and rescue technologies. We have developed a heavy lifting airbag, which is the kind of thing that you might see a fire service use in developed countries, in rich countries, when a building has collapsed and people are trapped under the rubble. You can put the airbag in between the rubble, inflate it, and it lifts the rubble up so that you can pull the people out. And we've been working with partners in Syria, humanitarian agencies operating in Syria, to make this sort of rescue equipment. We've made a heavy lifting airbag that is now in use by the White Helmets in Syria, locally made by our engineers in Idlib and costing about $50. The off-the-shelf versions cost about $2,000 in the US. And then you've got to get them to Idlib, which is no small task, and actually they've just been doing without for a long time during the Syrian crisis. The way that we want to try and expand that now, we've done all the research, we've done all the testing, it meets British standards. There is a standard for this sort of rescue equipment. And we've done all the testing, we've proven it. We now are codifying that into a manual that we're releasing in Arabic and a training program within Syria so that more people can make these things themselves to the standards that we are happy with. I mean, this is ultimately where our name comes from, that we want to try and make things that we can certify as being field ready, that these things are ready to go to be used and meet standards. Obviously, an airbag that isn't made to a good enough standard is a serious liability and a risk to life for the responders, because if this thing bursts whilst it's holding up a building, holding up a pile of rubble, it's pretty serious. So we're codifying some of that into a training manual and training program in Syria. The example from Kenya, the research, I'm now in Nairobi to help wrap up, GIZ and IBM funded project to look at how can we organize contracts with and business models with aid agencies so that local makers and manufacturers can be contracted to supply aid agencies as easily as through the sort of established centralized systems. So if you do need to have 200,000 umbilical cord clamps to be distributed around Kenya to all of the different health posts, is there a way, rather than getting 200,000 umbilical cord clamps procured from a single supplier in China and then shipping it over, is there a way that we can contract 2,000 or 200 local producers in a single transaction to make umbilical cord clamps locally and distribute them to their nearest health posts at a standard of quality that you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between something that's mass-produced or made locally. So we're working on a system that we've called, we've nicknamed it the MakerNet, the Internet of Makers.
I so love that you're going in this direction, because right now I'm just visualizing, I mean, the definition of standardization is bringing everything down to that single point, right? Where the input comes into the factory, it runs through a very predictable system, it comes out, and then you're like, okay, how much can we crank this up to? and in order to get the output. And whereas you're talking about literally the exact opposite of having these 2,000 points.
You get the same outcomes, but a different process.
Yeah, that's awesome. Is that early days, or is that, I mean, how close are you to the MakerNet doing it?
Yeah, it is early days. We've been doing some experiments over the last few months here in Kenya with a local partner, the Gearbox Makerspace, and some supply chain and small business experts. And we've been working mainly with health, in the health sector, with medical supplies, with organizations like Kenyan Red Cross and ARC, doing a few experiments here and there. But our research is basically finding that this is something that could be viable. And, as a group of the partners we've been working with in the consortium, the MakerNet consortium, we're basically looking to deliver a series of proofs of concept informed by our research over the next 12 months. So ask me back in a year, Stephen, and I'll be able to tell you some stories about that.
Deal. back on the show in a year for sure.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I have two questions I ask everyone as a part of every interview here on Terms of Reference during this innovation series, and one of them is, who do you pay attention to? You're a guy who is lucky enough. You fly around the world. You're working for this cool organization. How do you stay up to date? Who do you think is important? Is it blogs? Is it magazines? Is it Twitter feeds? Is it anybody that you'd put out there and say, you really should pay attention to this person?
I find there's no better substitute for getting to know innovators that are already within humanitarian aid agencies that are already in the field. So the innovative thinkers that you might find in head office are incredibly important relationships for us to have, because they can help us navigate particular organizations. But if you can find sort of innovative thinkers, and by which I mean, I can't really help you here, but you know them when you see them.
Sure. We've had a lot of them on this show. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Building relationships with them in different countries where we work, that's a really good way for us to find out what's happening as close to the front lines as possible, and what's needed as close to the front lines as possible, and where the pressure points are. So I would always recommend building relationships with innovative thinkers in the field if you're working in the humanitarian innovation sector, because it really helps you to keep it real. And then I have really benefited from the networks that the Humanitarian Innovation Fund have brought together, even from before Field Ready was funded by them. In my previous life, when I was running Engineers Without Borders or working as a consultant, the networks that sort of donor can bring together can be really valuable. So I follow work by ELRA, Enhanced Learning Research for Humanitarian Action, by ALNAP, by IDS, Institute for Development Studies, and those sorts of organizations which are really looking at the challenge of humanitarian innovation and trying to promote the humanitarian innovation ecosystem within the sector.
Last question is, it's a moment for you to geek out. Is there anything that's inside or outside, the Field Ready world that you just think is super cool? It could be a shiny object, it could be a process, it could be a person that you'd love to give a shout out to and just say, hey, watch for this. This is about to happen.
Oh, wow. Where do I begin? I think the need for a humanitarian use or application of blockchain payment systems, distributed payment systems and contract systems would be really, really important. That's an innovation I'd love to see us to take. It may not be something that we pursue ourselves, but that if something were to come up, an open platform to be delivered to help humanitarian aid agencies pay networks of people, that's something that would be really fundamental to being able to pay some of the makers that we might recruit locally in the future. I'm really interested in other types of innovations around augmented reality. One of the things that happens is you might laser cut or 3D print or otherwise cut a series of metal bars into a shape to make a hospital bed, for example, just following a set of instructions you might have downloaded off the internet. Well, I think what needs to happen then is you need to assemble it to become the finished product. And some of the augmented reality applications I've seen such as an app that's been developed for Enable, a 3D printing prosthetics group, where you hold your phone up in front of all of the parts that are laid out in front of you, and the augmented reality app shows you how to assemble them accurately.
Wow.
Just by walking you step by step. So it's like an IKEA manual or a Lego manual in real time on your phone, depending on what you're looking at the time. And I think that could be really helpful in terms of quality control. But I think the thing that I'm most interested in seeing that is not a technology-related thing, but is more of an attitude thing, is a mindset or an attitude within humanitarian aid agencies towards taking more risks with new technologies, with new innovations, with new approaches, so that we can be better at helping more people faster, cheaper, and better over the coming decades as humanitarian crises are predicted to grow around the world. I think that innovative mindset is something that should really become part of what the sector is known for.
Andrew, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from Aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.